This is the continuation of our session on interinstitutional relations within the United Kingdom. And we're very pleased to welcome 4 Scottish parliamentarians, if I've got that right, 4 members of the Scottish Parliament. And could I ask each of you to identify yourselves for the record, please?
Okay, Willie Rennie, I'm leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats.
I'm Richard Leonard, I'm the leader of the Scottish Labour Party.
I'm Adam Tomkins, I'm the Constitutional Affairs spokesman for the Scottish Conservatives.
I'm Patrick Harvie, I'm co-convener of the Scottish Green Party. We don't do leaders.
I understand that. Thank you very much indeed. And we'll need to crack on at a fairly speedy pace. So if somebody has given you the answer that you would have given, you can just say, I agree.
I'll be the first time.
We don't need to linger. And I will start, if I may, with the EU Withdrawal Bill and the new amendment which the government has tabled in the House of Lords, which changes the presumption so that powers now rest with the devolved level, and Westminster will only be involved in making temporary regulations to protect UK common interests or international obligations, while common positions and frameworks are being agreed. So in each of your views, how does this change the substance and effect of the original Clause 11?
Well, it turns it on its head, Mr. Chairman. So as you will know, the Scottish Parliament's Finance and Constitution Committee, on which I sit and Patrick Harvie also sits, was unanimous in its report a few months ago that the original Clause 11 was incompatible with our devolution settlement. And it was incompatible with our devolution settlement because it turned the fundamental of that settlement on its head. So one of the founding principles of devolution in Scotland, and has been since 1999, and now also in Wales, is that everything is devolved apart from that which is expressly reserved under the schedules to the Scotland Act 1998. And the effect of the original Clause 11 was unfortunately to turn that round. The amendments published by the government last week reversed that, and in my view, I mean, this is only my view, but in my view, the amendments are fully compatible with the recommendations and conclusions that the Finance and Constitution Committee came to in its interim report a few months ago.
Patrick Harvie.
Well, I disagree with Adam Tomkins on much of that. Yes, the Finance and Constitution Committee was unanimous at the time of looking at the original EU Withdrawal Bill and said that Section 11 was incompatible with devolution. I think the amendments which have been published remain incompatible with the devolution settlement, in particular the introduction of restrictions on actions that the Scottish Parliament or the Scottish ministers can take unless the questions of consent have been dealt with, and to define consent, to define legislative consent as the Scottish Parliament saying yes, and the Scottish Parliament saying no, and the Scottish Parliament saying neither. That is in no way a meaningful definition of consent. Whether in legislation or any other walk of life, consent has to be freely given without coercion. It has to be capable of being withdrawn at any time, and fundamentally it has to be respected. Section 30A in the new amendments very clearly make no fundamental respect for that legislative consent process. And let's remember that we're just a very brief time since the last Scotland Act, which purported to put into practice the recommendation of the Smith Commission, again on which Adam Tomkins and I were both members, which recommended that the Sewell Convention, that legislative consent convention, should be put on a statutory basis. Well, it was put on a statutory basis for 5 minutes, and the coach and horses was driven through it, and I'm afraid that remains the case.
Maybe one of Richard Leonard or Willie Rennie would like to respond to that.
I mean, my view, there has been some significant movement, but we still haven't got to the central issues, which is how do you resolve a dispute? And Westminster having the final say is not a dispute resolution procedure. You need to have some kind of mechanism where the devolved institutions and the United Kingdom government are able to agree without the Westminster having the final clout on everything. There needs to be a much better way of doing that. So we still haven't tackled that fundamental problem yet. Whether they're fundamentally devolved for a time period or they were reserved for a time period, it doesn't matter. We still need to solve it.
So who should have the final say?
I think there needs to be a co-decision-making procedure on issues of common interest and common power, which I think this is. We need to create a level playing field across the United Kingdom for the EU withdrawal bill, and the Westminster having the final say isn't sufficient. There needs to be some kind of mechanism around about perhaps qualified majority voting of sorts.
But
so
that would be like the Sewell Convention saying, instead of normally, saying never.
You could go down something like that, but what you can't have...
the point is, the Sewell Convention doesn't say never, it says normally.
Yes, exactly. So it's because it is just a convention, and it always has been a convention. But the issue is whether you're moving from a veto to overwhelming power, and that's where we've still got a problem. So that's why you need to have a dispute resolution procedure.
Richard Leonard.
Yeah, I mean, up until now, the devolution settlement founded around the 1998 Act has worked well. And it's only now that the Supreme Court has been called upon to adjudicate over a piece of legislation which the Scottish Parliament has passed. And I think underlying a lot of this is a complete breakdown of trust. And I have to say that the responsibility for that breakdown of trust, I think, lies with the way that the UK government approached the withdrawal bill with regard to the devolution settlement. I think, Adam Tomkins is right. There were members of the Conservative Party in the Scottish Parliament who also understood that there had been a failure, whether it was a failure in Whitehall or Westminster, to grasp the fact of devolution. Now, there has been some remedial action taken to address that, and I think I agree that there has been a degree of movement which has provided for people now to think about reaching settlement. But I do also take the point that Patrick Harvie makes, that the definition of consent is still problematic, and I think there are still knots in the bill as it stands that need to be untied.
Can I come back on one point about Sewell, Mr. Chairman, and just to explain why I think the amendments published last week are compatible with the devolution settlement, whereas the original Clause 11 was not. And it is because what the amendments do is they essentially copy and paste Sewell. Now, Sewell is a rule that has been a core part of our devolution settlement since its inception in the late 1990s. And it says, of course, that Westminster will not normally legislate on matters that are devolved without the devolved parliament's consent. And that's what the convention says, and it's a convention which is now not just an ordinary constitutional convention, it's an extraordinary constitutional convention because it is recognised, as Patrick Harvie said, in statute in the Scotland Act 2016, pursuant to a recommendation of the Smith Commission. So it's a constitutional convention given recognition in primary legislation. And that rule that Parliament, the Westminster, will not normally legislate on devolved matters without, in Scotland's case, our consent as MSPs, is exactly the basis of the amendment that was published last week, that powers will not normally be taken into the holding pattern under the revised Clause 11 without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, or as the case may be, Welsh Assembly or even Northern Ireland Assembly. And the searching for a power which is greater than that, which goes from, in your words, Mr. Chairman, normally to never, is to move from the spirit of devolution, which is intergovernmental cooperation, to something which is quite different, which is giving devolved administrations vetoes on powers, which doesn't happen. The Scotland Acts are not full of veto powers. They are full of requirements on ministers of all colours and in all governments to cooperate with one another. And that's what the revised Clause 11 does. That's why, in my view, it's good enough for the Welsh government, and it's disappointing that it's not good enough yet for the Scottish government, or at least not good enough yet for key members of the Scottish government. Although if you look at the papers in Scotland yesterday, you'll see that there are some significant differences between key players in Nicola Sturgeon's cabinet on this issue, it seems to me.
Mr. Harvie again.
Thank you. It's a source of great frustration that there's actually a lot of common ground, even though we disagree very fundamentally on some specific issues here. Adam Tomkins is absolutely right that intergovernmental and I would say interparliamentary cooperation should be the norm and is achievable. Since I've been a member of the Scottish Parliament, that has taken place on a whole range of different issues. During my first session, I was involved with charity law reform. Both parliaments conducting charity law reform at roughly the same time, coordinating their action, consulting on some of the same questions, legislating in a way that took account of each other's intentions. The same thing has happened on planning. The same thing has happened on issues like marine environment. Managing the marine environment was one of the examples that we took evidence on when our committee was hearing from witnesses on the EU withdrawal bill. This notion of common frameworks is entirely achievable without an extra restriction on the legislative ability and freedom of the Scottish Parliament or the Scottish Government. It has happened before, it does happen frequently, and it can only happen well in a respectful way when neither side of that cooperative relationship threatens a backstop and says, if you don't do it our way, we'll impose a solution. UK-wide common frameworks will be necessary. Everyone accepts that. They are achievable. Everyone believes that. But they are going to be best achieved in a spirit of respect and cooperation, not in a spirit of intimidation and coercion. And that is the way that even this new amendment reads.
How much
we
is
will
this
say we have consent if you haven't given it.
How much is this, in fact, an opportunity to resolve an ambiguity in the devolution settlement that was rather expertly fudged by the Sewell Convention?
It very much is a huge opportunity, I think, because in the last few years we haven't had, well, since devolution started, we haven't had these kind of frameworks, and perhaps we should have more frameworks across the United Kingdom, and agreeing a mechanism rather than just the ad hoc basis that we've had them up to now might actually be a good thing, and we could move towards that kind of federal structure that I would like to see, where the devolved institutions have a greater authority and say over the final decisions, rather than the ultimate sanction from Westminster being the final say.
Can I move on one sentence, Mr. Leonard?
Yeah, I mean, there's got to be negotiation. And there is another tension in the Scotland Act, if you like, which is around, on the one hand, the Schedule 5 competencies, and on the other hand, the demand for the maintenance of a UK single market. And so those 24 areas where there is still no resolution, at least half of those, as I understand it, are around that tension. And so my view is that the two governments need to keep working at getting a negotiated settlement around those competencies so that this can then be enacted as a piece of legislation, because the people have voted for Brexit, and I think it's incumbent on politicians to work together to find a way through that.
But I take it from your answers that Mr. Tomkins and Mr. Leonard would accept the amendment, Clause 11 amendment as it stands, as a sufficient compromise, maybe plus some other things, but you would accept that in withdrawal bill, but Mr. Rennie and Mr. Harvie would not. Is that correct?
I think further compromise and agreement is required, yeah.
Mr. Harvie?
You're certainly correct that I wouldn't accept it. I don't think I'd quite heard whether Richard was, and I hope he's not accepting it.
No, we wouldn't accept it because there are still more aspects of this which need to be addressed. And I think it still fails properly to recognise the 98 Act and the default position, which is about the powers resting with the Scottish Parliament and not the UK Parliament.
Quite right.
And does the Labour Party in London agree with that position?
I haven't spoken to the Labour Party in London as you characterise it, Mr. Jenkin, but I shall be doing so over the course of the next 2 days, rest assured.
Anyway, you'll see that one or two of us have made speeches in the House of Commons that share the view that more could have been done to promote trust and understanding around this subject at the outset, so it's not just Conservatives in the Scottish Parliament. Moving on, David Jones.
Yes. As you know, the Scotland Act contains provisions which empower the Secretary of State for Scotland in certain cases to direct actions to be taken to ensure the compatibility of any actions taken in Edinburgh with the UK's international obligations. I think those powers have seldom, if ever, been used.
Never.
To what extent do you think that there is a possibility that they may have to be used after Brexit?
So this is the power in Section 58 of the Scotland Act, and there are equivalent provisions in the Government of Wales Act
Correct.
and in the Northern Ireland Act. So these are powers that the Secretary of State has to require devolved administrations either to do something to comply with the UK's international treaty obligations or to cease to do something which is incompatible with the UK's international treaty obligations, because in international law it is the United Kingdom and not the devolved administrations themselves who would be liable for any inadvertent or indeed deliberate breach of international law. That's what we're talking about. So the Section 58 power in Scotland, in the Scotland Act, has never been, to my knowledge, has never been used, never yet been used, and that is, I think, a reflection of how well, in agreement with something that Patrick Harvie said a few minutes ago, that is a reflection, I think, of how well this element of, if you like, the informal side of the devolution settlement has hitherto worked in the United Kingdom, which is to say that when there are concerns that UK ministers have, that there may be a development that could be, there may be a development with a devolved administration that could breach or risk breaching international law. These things are sorted out and ironed out in either at official level or, if necessary, at ministerial level in correspondence and communication between governments. So we haven't needed to use, the sharp end of the law. We certainly haven't needed to go to court. We haven't needed to use anything resembling a Section 58 power in order to ensure that the United Kingdom isn't in breach of its treaty obligations. Look,
if I may interrupt you, I mean, to what extent do you think that's going to be changed by the disappearance of the European Union, the overarching presence of the European Union?
I don't see any reason why it should be changed, but I do see that there is yet again a revived urgency to ensure that what I've called the informal side of devolution, that the intergovernmental communications, the intergovernmental framework is fit for purpose. It is going to be stress tested by Brexit, because there is no doubt that the repatriation of powers from the European Union to the United Kingdom, wherever they sit in the United Kingdom, is going to require us all, whether we are in government or in opposition, whether we are in Westminster or in a devolved legislature, to rethink the way in which the governments of these islands do business with one another, and indeed the way in which the parliaments of these islands do business with one another. That is going to be stress tested, but there is no reason, in my view, to believe that the current informal arrangements can't continue to adapt and survive. The chairman talked earlier about constitutional fudge, and I'm all in favour of constitutional fudge if it avoids writing things down in an overly legalistic way, which might make money for my good friends at the faculty, but we'll see what I regard as political questions ending up in courts of law more frequently and not less frequently. And that's why I'm nervous about these kind of calls for federalism that we hear from time to time. So I think that the fudge that we've got can continue to work in the post-Brexit environment, in my view, if the will is there on all sides to make it work.
We've got 3/4 of an hour. Until the minister arrives. And I think we owe it to the minister to see him on time. So the more you talk about this means we're not going to get through the questions. So have any of you got anything to add to?
I don't think the politics drives Section 58 to be used. I think we don't have governments in Scotland that tend to go rogue, and therefore I don't believe that it would be used in future. I think it's a backstop. I think the debate is elsewhere.
I'll just add very briefly, I agree that there's no reason to presume that this would become more of a problem in the future, although Adam Tomkins is again right on an issue where we'll agree that if indeed we are taken out of the European Union, and notwithstanding there are still many of us who are deeply opposed to that course of action, it will inevitably change the relationship between governments and parliaments within these islands, and we should be open to having that debate. I think the one thing I would add is that there are enforcement powers which are currently often needed to be used against both governments. I would give the example of air pollution. Both Scottish and UK governments have had to be taken through enforcement actions to ensure that the actions that are necessary to give people safe air to breathe are being taken. We've still not got to the point of fully implementing that, either in Scotland or the rest of the UK. And so there remains a question about at what level and through what institutions will either government be capable of having enforcement action taken by proceedings initiated by members of the public or those representing particular interest groups or issues. It's not just about the Scottish Parliament.
Very briefly.
Just very briefly, Fudge suggests opaqueness. There needs to be transparency and openness, and that's why we have called for joint ministerial committees of the future to be on a statutory footing and for their minutes to be available,
right,
and for people to understand
you'll get an
what decisions
opportunity
have been taken on their behalf.
You'll be getting an opportunity to talk about that. Rupa Huq.
Actually, I think people have already kind of dealt with this to some extent. Just the fact that since the Scotland Act 1998, and even since Tony Blair originally said it would be like a parish council, these sort of devolved competencies and powers have incrementally grown. So it's a Mystic Meg question. How do you foresee this in the post-Brexit world if we do end up going out, which I hope, like yourself, we won't? And that's to everyone, really. Anything else to add?
I'll be brief on that. I don't think the next chapter of our ongoing conversation about the future of devolution in the United Kingdom is going to be about more powers. I think that's what most of the last 20 years has been about. I think that the next chapter is going to be about more cooperation, not more powers. It's not the self-rule bit of the equation that we need to focus on now, not the things which we as MSPs can do for ourselves because they're devolved. It's how we integrate devolved government with reserved government. It's the shared communication, it's the shared rule. That needs to be the focus now, not an endless search for more powers.
I would say that since the creation of the Scottish Parliament, which most political parties campaign for, even though the one political party that campaigned against it has grown accustomed to it and has grown to support the existence of the Scottish Parliament, yet there has remained throughout all of that period a sense that some have, I think particularly some parts of the UK government culture, seem to regard the Scottish Parliament almost as a department of the UK government, as a part of the UK government, which happens to be accountable to an elected chamber. I think that needs to change. If we're going to have a fully respectful relationship between the different institutions, we need also to respect the separate democratic legitimacy, and that, I think, is still missing to some degree.
Can I just say I agree with that? I agree with that.
Good. That was nice and brief. Anybody else? Good.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily the powers, the transfer of the powers that's the big debate. I think it's the cooperation between the different parts of the United Kingdom that's the big debate, and the reform of the UK institutions, whether it's the House of Lords or other arrangements. But that's what needs to change. The Scottish bit, actually, I think, has progressed very well. You could argue about some more tax powers in some areas and some other legislative powers as well. But by and large, I think that's relatively mature and should be allowed to develop. It's the cooperation, it's the co-decision making across the United Kingdom that needs to change.
Rupa Huq.
Yeah, in fact, that's what I wanted to ask about next. Richard Leonard, you said that there should be a statutory footing. We've heard this a lot in our evidence. And also when we went to Cardiff, where they let us in their parliament. I think you guys wouldn't allow us through your threshold. Anyway,
Is that right?
I don't, not you personally, but the statutes.
No, let's deal with that. There is, at the moment, something of a little standoff between the Scottish Parliament and the United Kingdom Parliament. We have capacity issues in our rooms. Unless we can provide reciprocal access, we should be allowing others' committees to meet on our own premises.
Yes, we should.
Absolutely. And it's work in progress. Okay. But I hope that
hopefully next time we can do it there. But yeah, so intergovernmental relations going on a statutory footing. What principles should underpin these relationships?
Well, I think that there ought to be, there should be a kind of parity of esteem. The situation is we are going from a model where you had a European Commission or still have a European Commission usually taking the initiative, subject to scrutiny by a European Parliament, which is then agreed upon or not through a qualified majority voting or unanimity in some areas of policy by a Council of Ministers, which is then subject to a European Court of Justice to oversee. And we don't have any of that apparatus here, really. So I think we need to consider, and that's obviously a multinational organisation, but I do think we need to consider within the UK what then works. And I think, you know, often in Scotland we've seen things almost on a bilateral basis. I think we need to look at things on a multilateral basis for the future. And I think, you know, Willie has mentioned it, and I think you took evidence in Wales where people spoke about the exploration of a qualified majority voting kind of model, and I think that's right. And I think it's in my view, it's got to be seen as part of a wider reform agenda for the distribution of power inside the UK. And I think that leads me, Adam disagrees, but it leads me to a consideration of a federal model. It leads me to a consideration of the reform of national regionally elected Senate type of model in its place. Could help to address some of these issues, as well as the joint ministerial working model that we've spoken about.
Just to briefly add, if there are going to have to be, and there may have to be, significant powers that are jointly exercised by ministers of multiple governments throughout the UK, then there also needs to be equally powerful inter-parliamentary scrutiny mechanisms. Those are absent, and there are significant formal ways that we can do that through joint meetings, which haven't happened very much. There's been some issues where different committees have had video conference meetings and so on, but it's not quite the same as jointly sharing a scrutiny role. And I think, I was about to say call you convener, but is it chairman?
I'd be honoured to be called convener.
In that case, convener, the little symbolic matters, like whether a committee of one parliament can meet in the other's building, do matter. As did we were just discussing this before the meeting began, the question of security passes. The original intention when the Scottish Parliament was created was that they would be reciprocally valid and recognised between the parliaments. And I think the Westminster authorities were reluctant to proceed with that. These little symbolic things could do a lot to reinforce the fact that we are and always will be, regardless of our constitutional relationship, in some form of relationship and communication between us.
Thank you for that. I mean, I'd just say we could make a safe assumption that the House of Lords is going to be an intractable issue for some time. What should we be doing in the meantime? Adam Tomkins?
Can I come on the question of whether intergovernmental relations should be placed on a statutory footing or not, which I think was part of your question.
It was kind of assumption. I think the question was meant to be what are the principles and what are the mechanisms if we do go ahead with all this.
I mean, I'm not too bothered about whether it's on a statutory footing or not. I am much more bothered about whether it works. You know, you could have an informal system of intergovernmental relations which has no recognition in statute at all, which works brilliantly. You could have a very formal or very overly formalised legislative suite of powers and obligations with regard to intergovernmental relations that don't work at all. And it seems to me that what matters is whether it works or not whether it's on a statutory footing or not. And the challenge that I think Brexit is going to pose to this. It was already a challenge that was being posed, but Brexit, I think, brings it to the fore even more because of the nature of some of the powers which are being repatriated from the European Union, is that so far there has, and I very strongly agree with what Patrick Harvie had to say about Whitehall, so far there has been a complete failure to recognise in Whitehall that effective intergovernmental relations will need to include co-decision, will need to include some mechanism by which policy decisions are made jointly between different administrations. That won't always be easy because it will often be the case that different administrations have different political preferences in different parts of the United Kingdom. And what we need to do is to find a mechanism, whether it's on a statutory footing or not doesn't matter, Well, what we need to find is an effective mechanism of enabling that co-decision, that joint decision-making, that joint policy-making to work. And then, again, very strongly in agreement with what Patrick Harvie had to say about this.
This is getting uncomfortable, Adam.
There needs to be robust interparliamentary scrutiny of that joint decision-making process. Richard said that the problem with fudge is that it lacks transparency, it's opaque, and he's absolutely right about that. We do need to think very carefully about how we open up the structure of intergovernmental relations to effective parliamentary scrutiny. Now, in the Scottish Parliament, we have two rules, which, as I understand, you don't yet have in Westminster. Those rules aren't always adhered to in the Scottish Parliament, but they are there. One rule is that the relevant committee of the Scottish Parliament is entitled to see the agenda of any joint ministerial meeting before that meeting takes place, preferably in time for us to be able to call that minister into account and say, what do you plan to talk about when you go down there, or what do you plan to talk about when the Westminster minister comes to visit you? And we are entitled to see the minutes of those meetings as soon as possible. Now, that doesn't always happen. And, for example, the most recent meeting of the Joint Ministerial Working Group on Welfare, which is a bilateral between the DWP and the Scottish Government, we haven't seen the minutes of the most recent meeting because, as I understand it, there is a disagreement about what SNP ministers said at that meeting. But we don't. So the rules are not always honoured as I would like them to be as an opposition MSP, but they are there, and that is at least a start of a way in which you can try and secure some kind of effective parliamentary scrutiny of what ministers talk about behind closed doors in these various formats and meetings.
Interesting. Others will get a chance to come in. Rupa?
Yeah, Ronnie, you wanted to have it on a proper footing.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, the processes work when the spotlight is on, but as soon as the spotlight's somewhere else, then that's when it's prone to break down, and it won't matter as much politically at that point. So we've had, for the first few years of the Scottish Parliament, we wanted to make it work. Everybody wanted it to succeed. So the cooperation and the consent, and that all worked. And then we had the independence referendum, and everybody was tiptoeing around all that issue to make. So there was an interest in making it work. If independence goes off the agenda, which I hope it does, then there is a potential for us just to slip and us not to actually consider these issues in the time that we should.
Must go faster, Rupa Huq.
And should there be, I think Adam's already said yes, inter-parliamentary scrutiny of these intergovernmental relations? How should those bodies look like? What would they, consist of, or how would they be constituted?
Well, I think there's got to be, and I think the truth is the detail of that has still got to be worked through, because it needs to be something which is sufficiently fleet of foot that it's workable, but it needs to, because there's an important role to hold to account those multilateral discussions that will be, I hope, will be taking place. So precisely how that's composed is certainly sitting here today is difficult for me to describe, but I think the intent, the principle has got to be there, that there needs to be a parliamentary scrutiny of any ministerial decision-making in the future.
Yeah, I mean, we turn back really to where we began the discussion with the amendments to the EU withdrawal bill. If a future mechanism is going to fully respect the principle of parliamentary consent, then decisions which are jointly made by ministers in some kind of intergovernmental arrangement and which require parliamentary consent clearly require the consent of all the relevant parliaments, not only one of them. So the approach to how that's achieved, how the debate reaches the point where mutual consent can be given, is about communication and understanding and listening, but ultimately both parliaments, or all parliaments and assemblies, if that's the case, need to be in a position to say yes or say no and be respected.
Excellent. Kelvin, Hopkins, we are actually getting ahead.
Oh, well, that's good. Well, you've already given quite comprehensive comments on the kind of question I'm going to ask. But before that, this committee ran an online public forum to canvass public opinion in advance of this session, and found that 98% of respondents indicated that the UK and Scottish governments and parliaments do not work successfully together, with only 0.1% indicating that they work well together. That's a pretty devastating result, I think. But have you got anything to add to what you've been saying about how we can build trust and mutual respect?
Well, I think on the Brexit side, it is happening. It's beginning to happen. I mean, there is a forum in which the Chairman and I have met on several occasions now called, I think, the Interparliamentary Forum on Brexit. I've probably got its name wrong. But it's an informal coming together of the conveners, deputy conveners, chairs of committees in the Scottish Parliament, Welsh Assembly, House of Commons and House of Lords to discuss, to exchange notes and exchange ideas about the way in which our various legislative houses are seeking to hold ministers to account for the way in which they are trying to deliver the Brexit process. And the chairman has welcomed that. I have welcomed it, as has Bruce Crawford, who's the convener of the committee on which Patrick and I both serve. And I think that's a very useful start. But if there are rules in either the House of Commons or in the Scottish Parliament that somehow prevent Commons committees from meeting in the Scottish Parliament estate or vice versa, and certainly that it's not straightforward getting into the Westminster Parliament if you've only got a Scottish Parliament pass, then these are the sorts of things that could very easily, it seems to me, be sorted out on a logistical basis. And the more we, the easier we make it for ourselves to do business with each other, the more likely we are to do business with each other. We'll probably find that we quite like each other, and we've got quite a lot in common, and we quite like doing business with each other, and we'll do it more.
I don't know how big the sample size was to arrive at that 98% vote, and the truth of the matter is that
it was 1,300 respondents.
Okay, yeah. So
they were
sample size,
self-selecting.
yeah. But I suspect it's a reflection of the narrative in Scottish politics at the moment, which is largely caricatured by the UK government doing things to us. When I would always qualify it by saying it's a Conservative government which is taking these decisions, but that's not often how it's caricatured. I think that even when the same party was at least sharing power in the Scottish Parliament and in power at a UK level, there were still tensions then. And whilst there were discussions which took place, and it's probably easier within the context of being in one party, or one party being, as I say, sharing power in one institution and being in power in the other, there were still some difficulties around that. But I don't think at that point the public perception would be a 98% sense that the Parliament or the governments do not work together cooperatively. And I suppose that sets as a challenge, doesn't it? If there is broad agreement that 98% dissatisfaction rate, or however it's relayed, means that there's an awful lot of yardage, meterage that we can gain to pull that back, because it clearly it makes more sense for governments on the shared island to be cooperating.
The whole thing is complicated, I think, if you're suggesting that it by different political parties in power in different places, the divisions between political parties everywhere, the divisions within political parties, which is equally complex, I think, and it's all coloured by views on the EU, views on independence, and so on. So it's not just an academic discussion between professors.
Could I just? I think you're right that if there's going to be a stable constitutional relationship between Scotland and the rest of the UK, and Scotland is inside the UK, albeit that issue will no doubt resurface at some point, it has to be a relationship that's capable of surviving periods when there is political closeness between different administrations, and when there is a great deal of political distance between the administrations, when the relationships are warm and friendly and when they're less so. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that your poll, your survey result more reflects the fact that disagreements and arguments get more coverage. And I would mention again the issue of marine planning, marine spatial planning, protecting the marine environment. Complex, multi-layered area of legislation and regulation. It took years to deal with through both parliaments, many competing interest groups around access to and use of the marine environment. Some of it devolved, some of it reserved, some of it European, and just, it is a good example of how cooperation can exist and does exist and has taken place well when both parliaments respect each other's legitimacy, don't try to tread on each other's toes, but listen and try to achieve something that is consistent and coherent. It does happen. It just doesn't get a lot of play in the media, understandably.
I think the politics does drive the narrative, the story that it's all loggerheads between the UK and the Scottish governments, and it isn't the case that it's always like that. But I actually think what might restore some of the damage or repair some of the damage that's been done over this process is if the Scottish and Welsh government were actually to win the day in an argument that the UK government didn't agree with, and they were quite clearly unhappy about that outcome. That actually might just show that the institutions and the frameworks of the United Kingdom actually do reflect the diversity that's within the United Kingdom. Now, I don't know what that subject would be. It might be this one, it might be another issue. But actually, on occasion, just the small guy winning might actually just repair some of the damage that's been done as a result of this whole Brexit process, which I think Adam would agree has been cack-handed, and it's been crass in its management. Because it's been imposed. There was little discussion. Getting the dialogue working effectively has been hopeless. So actually, it might something like that might restore some of the damage that's been done.
We've done 3 reports, if I'm correct, on interinstitutional relations. And we've come up with a number of suggestions, and I'd be interested in your reaction to some of them. One is, as we've discussed, putting JMC onto a statutory footing. Another was that there should be somewhere less political to discuss the distribution of powers and the formation of joint frameworks, something more like the Cowan Commission, where these things were looked at sort of more forensically and dispassionately and expertly. What do you think of the suggestion that there should be a sort of standing advisory commission on shared powers?
I think the second one is always political. I think it's going to be difficult to make it in a more neutral, non-political environment. I think the first one's a very good idea. It's something that we've supported for some time. We did through the Smith Commission process. Michael Moore was a strong advocate of making the GMCs a much more central part of our intergovernment and interparliamentary arrangements. So we're very much in support of that. But the second one, it might be worth doing it. It might make it more neutral, might make it much safer and much more professional. But I think the idea that it wouldn't be political, I think, is
okay. Well,
I'll
remove that suggestion that it's not going to be political, but to have more paper, more discussion, more process around these issues on a permanent basis, rather than just relying on the government making a proposal and then everybody reacting to it. Anybody else?
I think I'm inclined to agree with Willie about both elements of that, at least to some measure. I mean, as I said before, I don't think it matters whether JMC is on a stratgy footing or not. I think what matters is whether it works. And one of the things that would make it work is more transparency around the process, more regularity around the process.
Very interesting ideas you've given us.
And all of that. Do we need a standing committee on powers and where powers lie? No, I don't think so. But do we need to do some pretty quick learning from other countries around the world or other countries in Europe where there is multi-layered government, whether federal formally or not, about how governments communicate with one another and cooperate with one another in the delivery, in the design and delivery of shared policy responsibility? Yes, we do. Because as I said in an earlier answer, all of our conversation about devolution in the last 20 years has been about powers. And now it needs to not be about powers, it now needs to be about cooperation and how we deliver that.
And Patrick Harvie, you want to add something?
Well, just to say that I don't think any of us should pretend that we have all the answers to this question. I think everyone is slightly feeling their way through this process at the moment. I would, just in relation to the way that you framed the question, you made a reference, I think, to the Cowan Commission. And I think that would not be a good model because it was explicitly established with an intent to exclude 2 of the political parties in the Scottish Parliament. It was explicitly designed to be a discussion which excluded the possibility of independence even being considered. Now, if you're doing that, then clearly the political parties, which were at the time the largest and smallest in the Scottish Parliament, could not sign up to that remit. And there seemed to be no willingness on the part of the parties that initiated that process, and it was initiated by political parties. There seemed to be no willingness to be flexible about that remit and to ensure that it could be the broadest possible discussion. And it would need to be the broadest possible discussion, recognising those fundamental differences.
So it would have to be a Cowan ++ to satisfy you?
Well, the only time that all 5 political parties in Scotland have sat around the table together to talk about Scotland's constitutional future is the Smith Commission. And there is no member of the Smith Commission who wants to do that again.
Largely because it was given an absurdly complex job on a breakneck timescale. I don't think any of us would be looking for kind of emergency crash courses of that kind in the future.
Mr. Leonard.
JMC on a statutory footing and learn some international lessons. I mean, I met with the Swiss ambassador last week, and of course they are outside the EU. They have mechanisms in place to make sure that there is alignment with decisions taken in the EU around the single market, so that they can retain access to it. And so I think there are. I'm not saying for a minute that we should simply transplant the Swiss model here. But I think we need to learn from those international experiences of life beyond membership of the EU and fashion it in a way which suits our circumstances. And our circumstances very much now include the devolved parliaments and assemblies of the United Kingdom.
And we looked at how we can develop the Interparliamentary Forum on Brexit. At the moment, there is very little that happens formally, and we've suggested that there should be some kind of Interparliamentary Council of the United Kingdom that would meet regularly, rather modelled on the Council of Europe, and scrutinise the intergovernmental process. What do you think of that idea?
You need to make sure that it's seen as a body that actually has influence over the process. And there's a danger you could set up bodies that are actually not that influential, and with people that are not that influential, they don't carry the weight and the authority. So it needs to be you need to be sure that you send people that are sufficiently senior, and those senior people would only go to it if it did have that authority. So setting up a whole range of bodies, actually more is not necessarily better. Making sure they've got authority is probably the way to do it.
Anybody else?
I think I much prefer the abolition of the House of Lords.
Okay, well, again, I think it's a safe assumption that's not going to happen for a long time.
Can I just comment that one of the problems with commissions and any kind of body set up in British Isles is that the control is always at the centre, and Prime Ministers in particular make sure they've got their place persons on those committees to make sure they get the right result. That's what's really happened. And in some areas, it's absolutely vital to do that. Northern Ireland, the balance between the two sides, if you like, in Northern Ireland was always most carefully scrutinised and arranged, especially the Northern Ireland Housing Commission back 40 years ago, whenever, to make sure that housing was fairly allocated. That had to have the right political balance, and if there was a majority for, should we say, the Republican side rather than the Unionist side, that would have caused problems, I think, in Northern Ireland. So a one-seat majority for unionism, that was okay, and it sort of worked. But Prime Ministers classically control appointments, and the most extreme example perhaps was Tony Blair, who made sure that he had people on certain bodies and certain commissions, make sure that he's done. Specifically, House of Lords reform, I, like Richard Lennon, was an abolitionist, a unicameralist, and I asked why that was not one of the options considered. And I was just told that was not on the agenda, basically shut up.
And your question is?
My question is, are these going to be independent bodies, or are they actually, in our system, going to be fixed?
I think the more we can talk about substance rather than process, the easier it will be for the process to sort itself out. So, let me give you an example of what I mean. At the moment, we are partway through what is the biggest single transfer of powers from Whitehall to the Scottish Government, and that's, of course, in the field of social security. Now, I also sit on the Social Security Committee in the Scottish Parliament, and we need to talk with the Work and Pensions Committee in the House of Commons to find out how DWP are handling the transfer of powers and how the Scottish Government are handling the transfer of powers, and how they're handling the transfer of information about the transfer of those powers to the Scottish Parliament and to the House of Commons. And we do. And we don't worry too much about the process because we've got a specific policy issue that we need to address substantively. And I think that's the level at which this should work post-Brexit too. So, if it turns out that there is a significant argument between different governments at different levels or different governments of political colours about agricultural subsidy or about food labelling, then the relevant committees of the House of Commons and the devolved legislatures can and should get together to jointly hold those ministers to account for what they're doing in those meetings.
Can I just also ask a reaction? We are doing one or two housekeeping things in committees. We are arranging for committees, if I'm correct, to be able to accept a guest, and that guest could be a member of a committee from a devolved parliament into the committee for the cross-examination of a minister or the cross-examination of a key witness. We think this is would be quite a significant development. Do you think the Scottish Parliament would consider a reciprocal arrangement along these lines?
I don't know whether it would, but I for myself think that it should. I think that the more we can integrate each other in our work of holding governments to account for the work that they do in terms of the intergovernmental decision making and intergovernmental cooperation that happens in the United Kingdom, the more we can do to help ourselves undertake that task robustly, the better our democracy will be.
We have the advantage that any select committee can meet anywhere it wants. I don't think you have the same freedom in the Scottish Parliament. I think your select committees have to meet on the premises, or at least in Scotland. Correct me if I'm wrong. We would very much like to welcome formal meetings of Scottish committees at Westminster, and maybe even joint meetings between reciprocal committees. Is this something that do you think we can fruitfully discuss?
I think all of these options should certainly be explored. I'm also a member of the Procedures Committee in the Scottish Parliament, and so if your committee wanted to write to either the Presiding Officer or the Procedures Committee to explore those issues, I expect there'd be some openness to them. I do think, though, that there are other aspects that go beyond parliamentary rules. Many devolved parliamentary committees, certainly in Scotland, I suspect elsewhere, have found it very difficult to get UK ministers to come and give evidence. And there will always be UK decisions which impact on wholly devolved areas. Housing, for example, has been fully devolved since the creation of the Scottish Parliament. But if the rules on housing benefit change, which obviously are held at a UK level or largely have been, that clearly is going to have an impact on Scottish housing policy. So you need to be able to take evidence from and hold to account at some level for their impact on devolved issues, UK ministers as well. That's been profoundly difficult.
And I'd very much like to re-emphasise the point. Personally, I would like reciprocal access through exchange of passes to each other's premises. I think that would be sensible. Can I ask, finally, in our previous session, Professor Michael Keating told us that there should be a set of principles. We should develop a set of principles underpinning future UK devolved government relations. What do you think that set of principles would look like?
Well, I think the principles need to include transparency. They need to include an end to a very often what's seen as a very kind of London-centric view. And
we feel this in England too, you know.
and which is why I think the idea of putting things on a statutory footing makes so much sense, because I do actually also think that would work. So the principle of transparency, of a kind of an equality of the position. How you then resolve that within the context of England, I think, is a big question, because does that look like England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, or does it look like England subdivided in some way, in a method yet to be determined and agreed upon? And in the end, that's for the people of England to decide upon. So I think that there are, but there has got to be, at the end of it, some kind of equality of esteem and equality of a greater equalisation of power, I think, as well.
A last word, anybody?
I'm not sure there'd be a huge amount of value in writing down a set of principles as a wish list, if in fact they're not being adhered to. I think there's a huge amount of work, and it will take a long time to improve intergovernmental relationships and to improve interparliamentary mechanisms as well. If that is done, if that hard graft is done, and I suspect it will have to be after the profoundly divisive issue of Brexit is resolved one way or the other, if that is done, then it may be possible that a set of principles can emerge as an accurate description of what is happening rather than as a wish list.
I think trust, respect, I think a learning culture of recognising that different parts of the United Kingdom can do things and they can do things well. It doesn't have to necessarily be created by Westminster in order to be effective. Openness, and I think equality is another principle that should be regarded too. And as long as the Westminster continues to represent England as well as the United Kingdom, there will be an advantage of Scottish parliamentarians or Welsh Assembly members going on to UK committees to ask about relevant issues. Whether it's the other way around, you could argue in the area of international development, where we've done more on, there might be an advantage of having some reciprocal agreement. But I don't think there would be a great advantage in having UK parliamentarians scrutinising Scottish health ministers about the Scottish NHS because it's wholly devolved. So I think we need to clarify the UK constitution before you could really have a truly reciprocal arrangement going forward.
I'm a bit more sceptical about this, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I don't think that there is such a list of principles in the United States or in Canada or, so far as I know, even in Switzerland, certainly not in Germany, which are all, very functioning and mature federal jurisdictions. I think what there is a much more significant need for is a change of culture and understanding in Whitehall that this is not a unitary state. It is a multi-government state. It is a multinational state, and leaving the European Union does not mean in any way that we revert to the Constitution of 1972, which is the year we joined. We are leaving the European Union in a constitutional environment which is very different indeed from that which pertained in the early 1970s. And if that could be understood, I think it is understood in Westminster. I think it isn't always understood in Whitehall. And if I could have one single wish out of this, it would be that change of culture could happen sooner rather than later in Whitehall. I think that would avoid a lot of the problems that we've encountered since June 16.
Well, thank you very much. And if, with the permission of your colleagues, if that can be the last word, I think it's been a smashing session and given us plenty to think about and some good ideas for some further recommendations to make. We're very grateful to you. The committee will adjourn for 5 minutes. The Minister is here and we will resume at 11:30 precisely.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Order.
The proceeding is currently suspended.